I will try to be quick, as I don't think we have too much time, right? We have 30 more minutes, if I'm not mistaken.
No, an hour. An hour. It's okay.
Oh, we have an hour. Well, first of all, let me begin with an apology. Denis couldn't have make it. He has very bad internet. But also, not just with an apology, but also an acknowledgement. And that's acknowledgement of two comrades that have passed relatively recently. One of them is Trivo Injic, whom Vadim might remember, probably the most important for Yugoslavia, where I'm speaking from right now, who in 1972 wrote an essay about the relevance of anarchism, or anarcho-communism, as he called it, and in a journal titled Praxis, which was a Marxist humanist journal, or we would call today maybe value theory Marxist journal, of a group called Praxis. And that was the very beginning of the rediscovery of anarchism for the generation of libertarian socialists or libertarian communists that I am a part of. Trivo Injic has passed a few months ago. The other person who helped me in many ways discover Kropotkin, who died almost 1 year ago, is David Graeber. And I would like to take this opportunity to mention David and to mention the enthusiasm and appreciation he had for Kropotkin, which was immense. I met David probably in the mid-90s, and our meeting was a very strange one. We met after a conference organized by Pierre Bourdieu and a French sociologist. And it was a conference about the gift. And David and myself were extremely confused. I was coming from socialist, still a formerly socialist Yugoslavia. He was coming from the United States. And we were looking at these people who were suffering from this discovery, neoliberal vertigo, discovery of deconstruction and everything else, Derrida. And all of a sudden, there was absolutely no possibility to speak about a gift. They were all talking about a gift as if the gift, or generosity of any kind, is only a sort of a cynical ploy, a strategy that people would use to deceive each other. There was nothing in terms of what Mitchell was talking about, reciprocity, giving, generosity. Everything was, in a certain sense, strategic. And David and myself made a little bit of a pact and said, well, we have to go against this. We call it economism in these days. We have to go against the economism in social sciences. How about, David said, you take Kropotkin and I will take Marx, and together we are going to try from different ways, focusing either on exchange or on things that I ended up focusing on, which are non-state relations, to confront this kind of economism, which discounted the very possibility of generosity and was prepared to deconstruct absolutely everything except greed. Very confusingly, we continue to do that together, and it's with great regret that I am doing this without David. This presentation, as we have recently published for PM Press an introduction to the book Mutual Aid. And in that book, you can see some of the last thoughts that David had on Kropotkin and on the relevance of the work of Piotr Kropotkin, of course, focused on the book Mutual Aid. Now, for me, perhaps after I left that meeting with David many years ago in New York, what became extremely important was to understand what is that Piotr Kropotkin meant with this idea that the history of humanity is a history of struggle between the institutions of mutual aid and institutions of individualism. He goes in mutual aid to speak about something in a very interesting way. He speaks about state, but also capitalism, developing by crushing cooperative solidarities. But he says this is a radical departure from what is natural, from what should be normal. We have a situation in which capitalism and the state continue, and they develop by crushing this autonomous form of existence. However, they're never completely successful. And what happens is they leave these concrete areas, spaces, inhabited by people who live more or less, he says, independently from capital and the state, organizing and preserving their way of life, relating to each other and to nature in a ways that are distinctly not capitalist, not alienated. Of course, he wasn't using this language, but he was saying something, and there was one fantastic word that he used, expression, which was there, he says, vibrant interstices. And these vibrant interstices, these non-state spaces, non-state activities, are basically the building blocks of socialist, stateless society. And ever since then, and I was still relatively young, for me it began this interesting intellectual struggle of understanding what are these vibrant interstices that Kropotkin was talking about. What are these relations and relationships of mutual aid, and how can we understand them? Perhaps with his advice, and his advice was, I think, on the page 14 of Mutual Aid in the new edition by PM Press, in which he says that the role of radical scholars is to go back to history, and with the help of everything that is available for us today, all the tools of contemporary ethnology, ethnography, and so forth, to go back to the past and to resurrect, so to speak, all of those institutions and practices that used to unite people. Enough, he said, with those things, with that focus on conflict. We should finally start looking into those things, practices, ideas that people used in order to live in solidarity. And that is the true task of radical scholarship. So for me, that project became something that I started calling anarchist anthropology. There are many different names. Abdullah Hocalan, I'm a great fan, rebel sociologist from Kyrgyzstan, he calls it sociology of freedom. There are other terms, of course, and there are other that we can use. Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who I believe is well known in Portugal, is using a term that was always helpful to me, sociology of absences and sociology of emergences. It basically captures this double movement, intellectual movement of Kropotkin, which means sociology of absences, understanding all of these real existing institutions and practices that were actively produced as non-existent, as non-valuable. And sociology of emergences, trying to construct on the basis of those same practices that were made previously invisible, something that is actually better and something that is and could be a block of a different, new, free society. So I think that this Kropotkin's intellectual double movement, this call for a new social science that we can call anarchist anthropology or sociology of freedom, whatever we decide, is something that is extremely important and something that we should really go back to. After a detour that I think we took in the 90s and perhaps the beginning of the 2000s, I think that the rediscovery of this focus on generosity, on relationships of reciprocity, mutual aid, solidarity, and so forth, is something that scientists, not only social scientists, but scientists in general, should make into focus of their inquiry. What for me and for Denis became very important is to understand what is the relationship between mutual aid and development of historical capitalism. When I read about vibrant interstices, I didn't really know how to study them. Kropotkin didn't leave us much traces. He said, you look for these vibrant interstices. They're relatively independent from the processes of state and capital. But he didn't say how. And he really didn't say where to find them. He, of course, left some traces and some hints, but they were not definitive. So the most immediate place to look was the work of anarchist anthropologists. Pierre Clastre immediately came to mind. I devoured his Society Against the State, which is a beautiful book. He has this famous epigraph that many of you remember, I'm sure, that the history of people without history is history of their struggle against the state. And he was immensely helpful, but to a point. And so was his disciple, James Scott. And James Scott continued this line of thinking. And James Scott wrote finally, I think in 2009, his book on Zomia appeared, the book about non-state spaces. He was inspired by Kropotkin, but he never mentions Kropotkin, and he never really writes about mutual aid, which is very curious. And then in the same line of research, we have, for example, Raul Zibecki from Latin America and many others whom I'm not going to mention now. But these are the people who are focusing very interestingly, but also very curiously, on relationships, 5 minutes, on relationships that are extremely interesting, extremely important, but somehow without any significant reference, with the exception of Zibecki, to capitalism. So for Denis and myself, the idea, which finally came in a form of a book, Living at the Edges of Capitalism, Adventures in Mutual Aid and Exile, our idea was then to try to understand capitalism from the perspective of mutual aid. Now, this was extremely difficult and not very easy, and our way out, and the way for me to understand vibrant interstices, perhaps, was Fernand Braudel. So, French historian who wrote beautifully about what he called black holes in the capitalist world economy. And he said something to the effect, you can look at world history and you're going to be able to find these spaces that are relatively independent from capital. They're part of what I call material life, I'm paraphrasing. And this is the space that capitalism always tries to commodify, but never completely succeeds. It's an enormous layer of economy that is never completely disciplined by the commodity form. And he goes on to say somewhat pessimistically, and Jim Scott was also somewhat pessimistic in his conversation about Zomia and non-state spaces. They're very hard to research. You can't really understand these spaces. They're far away, they're black hole in the world economy for a reason. They usually live on the mountains or inaccessible regions like lakes, swamps, and so forth. And they are completely outside of the commercial exchange. Now, to us, that was tremendously inspiring. So what we try to do is to relate vibrant interstices that Kropotkin writes about to black holes of world economy, of capitalist world economy that Fernand Braudel focused on, and to try to propose that a new social science, or at least a new understanding or different understanding of historical capitalism, should be based on notions of mutual aid and practices of mutual aid. So I'm going to just summarize what we mean by this in several forms and in several theses, perhaps. So what would it mean to think about the development of capitalism from the perspective of mutual aid? What would it actually be if we were to think about analysis of capitalist world economy from a space of contradictions that shows that capitalism, with its endless accumulative drive, is never really able to completely imprison life? We see, or we are able to see, the instability of processes of accumulation and incorporation that are a result of the way of processes and practices of mutual aid and the way that they insert themselves into the logic of capital. Mutual aid itself, within capitalist world economy, consists of the flow of cooperative relations that are produced at the edges of state and capital social relations as part of what Braudel calls material life. It is in these spaces, exilic spaces we ended up calling them, and exilic processes of material life that are historically and systematically ignored, that we find social capacity to change and to deform, or to challenge and to deform, and occasionally even break capitalist social relations. And this is why we need something that I can call Kropotkinian inversion in our analysis of the development of capitalism. Capitalist accumulation, or capitalist appropriation, is an ongoing struggle against the flow of cooperative activities that resist and that promote this vital collective capacity that capital cannot overcome. So if we put mutual aid at the center of capitalist world economy, we can observe the processes of production of value and commodities, of accumulation, separation, exploitation, dispossession, and all of that, that are situated, but also those processes, exilic processes, that are situated beyond these violent processes of capital, places and spaces where people construct cooperative organizations. Although these relations are ambiguously and contradictorily coexisting with capitalist social relations, they are still minimally produced within the capitalist sphere of value production. So instead of keeping, which is the way that most Marxist political economists go on about, keeping an exclusive focus on people and nature as labor force, and centering our analysis on contradictions that destroy social life, rethinking capitalism from the perspective of mutual aid provides us with a key to understanding the possibilities of social transformation through the erosion or overcoming of the relation of capital. So the focus then is on contradictory material processes, social relations, political forms that sustain and are sustained by the cooperation and egalitarian organization of communal life beyond capital. So this shift in view allows us to ask two crucial and also intertwined questions. How does capital and state reincorporate the lives of specific local communities, and how do specific local communities resist and escape social relations imposed by capital and the state? This Kropotkinian inversion, this approach to study of history of capital at least, stands in contradistinction with those Marxist approaches that have neglected the cooperative dimension of social life, but also with those anarchist and feminist approaches that have focused exclusively on the cooperative aspects of social life. In other words, what we are doing, and I'm going to conclude with this, is we are inviting other social scientists to start thinking about capitalism and other forms of domination from the perspective of mutual aid, and to go back to this idea that Kropotkin wrote so eloquently about so many years ago, that the history of civilization, the history of the world, is nothing but a history of struggle between institutions of mutual aid and institutions of possessive individualism. But in this struggle, we have every reason to be optimistic. Thank you.